Good evening.
Good evening, Professor.
Okay, so the last two class we did the array, right? So we know the 1D array will give us a line of variables, and we call it the element or the entries of the array, and each array will have a name, data type, and for the 1D array we have the capacity, right? We need to specify the size. Now for the 2D array, it will be a table of the element or the entry. Right, so it still have the array name, data type. Now instead of the capacity, since we have a table of element, we will have the row count and the column count. Right, and we know to access a 1D array, we can go through then using a for loop. Now for the 2D array, since we have rows and columns, so we will have the nested for loop. Right, so with that, let's look at the next, our first example here. So similar to the exercise we did last class, there are 5 students in your class. They are Alex, Freddie, Jack, Kaylee, and Max. And let's say each of them has 2, 3 exams, and you want to come up with a program that will ask their score for each exam, and you want to calculate their average, then find the student with the highest average, and you want to print the name and their average out. Okay, so let's look at this question. So what's the data we need for this question? What's the data we need to set up the question? Okay, we need the name and we need a place to store the score, right? And later we need to calculate the average for each student, right? So all those variables, right, all those data we can store in an array, right? Since we have for the 5 students. Now for the name, we have like only 5 students, right? So we can store their name in an array. So that will be so first we want to have an array to store their name. So we have Alex, we have Freddie, we have Jack, Kaylee, and Max. And we also need a place to store all the exam scores. Now, what kind of array do we need to make here? (2D), right? So what's the dimension of this array? Okay, so it will be 3 by 5. So it will look like this. And then we also need a place to store their averaged. And what kind of array for the average? Okay, so it will be 1D with a capacity 5. So this is how we need to set up the data for the question, right? So to do so, we will have so for the name, right, we will always have this 5 students, so we can initialize it. And their name is the string data, so we have string array name, with capacity phi. And we can initialize it. And then for the score, let's say we have the integer type for the score. Now we know score, it will be a 2D array, so 3 by 5. And we also need a place to store the average, and average will be the double type. And we just need a capacity of 5. Now for the scored, we know that each column, right, are represented to the corresponding student in the name array. And each row will represent grade for exam 1, exam 2, and exam 3. And what's the task that we need to do in this question? How many tasks do we have if we want to break down the question? Right, so if you see the first thing, right, we need to ask them their score. So the task 1, and that's also an array task, will be reading the scores. And then the second task will be calculate their average. Now to calculate the average, you need to go through the whole table of score. So this is another array task. And then finally, you want to find the student with the highest average. Then you need to go through the average array. So this is also an array task. Right, I see people say there are 3 tasks. Now, finally, we want to print the name and then the average for that student, but this is not an array task. You can just print it. Okay, so once we break down the question, well, we can work on the code. So we already have the data set up. So to do the first task, we want to read in the score. And to read in the score, we want to fill in those scores table. And to fill in the whole table, this is a 2D array, so we know we will have a nested for loop. Doesn't matter we have which one for the outer loop, for the row and then the column. Okay, I see people say do outer loop for row and inner loop for the column. Well, if we have the outer loop for the row, that means we will read in the score row by row, right? So pretty much you will ask, what's the exam 1 score for Alex? What's the exam 1 score for Freddie? What's the exam 1 score for Jack? What's the exam 1 score for Kylie and for Max? And once you fill in the first row, you will move on to the next row. So you will go down row by row if you have the outer loop for the row, right? But you can do either way, right? If you want to set up the outer loop for the column, inner loop for row, that's also fine, right? So then instead of reading it row by row, you will read it column by column. then pretty much you will ask what's the exam 1 for ILEX, what's the exam 2 score for ILEX, what's the exam 3 score for ILEX. And once you fill in all the 3 exam score for a student, you will move on to the next one. So depends on how you want to fill up your data, you can choose which one to use, but it doesn't matter. As long as you give the corresponding input. Okay, so we will just do row by row. So we can start with R equal to 0. And then for R less than 3, right, we have 3 rows. Then R plus plus. And then in each row, we need to look at each column entry. Then we need to prompt the message where we want to ask them to enter score on exam. Now you need to tell them which exam you want. Now if you look at here, right, for the first row, it's representing the exam 1. And first row have an index 0. The second row is representing the exam 2, we have an index of 1. Right, so we want to ask was enter the score on exam R plus 1. Right, R is the index for the row and plus 1 will be the exam number. And then we will have the student. So followed by names with the corresponding column. Right, so this is we will ask what's the exam score on which exam for the student. And then you will store the input. Okay, so this will be the first text to read in the score. Any questions here? That should be R plus 1. We want to print out R plus 1. Right, so when we are doing, when R equals to 0, that means we are working on the first row. When R equals to 1, we are working on exam 2. When R equals to 2, we are working on exam 3. So that's why we need to add 1 to it. Good. Okay, then the next task is to calculate their averaged. Now, how do we find their averaged? Let's say we fill out the exam score. So we have their exam score to be how do we calculate the average for each student? Well, to calculate the average, we know we need the access to the whole score table, right? So to find the average for ILEX, you will go through the column. You need to add up the 3 score for Alex and divide it by 3 to get the average. And then to find the average for Freddie, you need to add the score on the second column that corresponds to Freddie and divide it by 3 to get average, and so on. So how should we set up the nested for loop here? What was the outer loop for? Okay, so the outer loop will be the column and inner loop will be the row, right? Because for each column, we need to add the entries for the corresponding, for the row for that corresponding column. So if you want to access the data row by row, then your outer loop will be row. If you want to access your data column by column, then your outer loop need to be column. Right? So that's one way you can determine should you set up the column for the outer loop or inner loop. Okay, so here we know we want to go by column. So our for loop will start with column, but the outer loop will be the column. So will be C equals to 0 up to C less than 5. And then C plus plus. Now for each column, you need to add the 3 exam scores. So you need to have a place to calculate the total score. Right, so we will initialize a variable called total, and that will calculate the sum of the score for each student. And then we will go through the for loop to add the row up. So we have int r equal to 0, r less than 3, r plus plus, and you will add those entry to total. Okay, and once you've done that, once you calculate the total for the average of the corresponding student, right, see? Right, because the column will tell you which student you are looking at. So the average will equal to the total number we calculate here divided by 3.0, since we want a double result. And that will finish the second test here. We are doing the average for each student. If you look at the question, we want to calculate their average. Calculate the average means the students averaged. So that's why we need to do it column by column. If you want to find the average for each exam, then you will do row by row. Then your outer loop will be for the row. Okay. And next. So once we find the average, we want to find student with highest average score. Now we know student with the highest average score, you will just go through the averaged array to find the student with the maximum score. But what we keep track with? Are we trying to keep track with the number, the score? Anyone? What do we want to keep track with when we trying to look for student with the highest average? If you look at it, you want to print the name and then the average of that student. So it will be indexed, right? So if you just store the maximum score for the average, it's not enough, right? Since you not only want to print out the highest average score, you also want to print out the name of the student who got that score. So you need to store something that they both have in common, so you can have access to both name and then the score. So we want to keep track of the index. Now we will initialize the maximum index with 0. Let's assume the first value will give you the maximum score, maximum average. Now we can update it if it's not. So we will go through the average array, and we know the average array is a 1D array. So we have int I for index from 0 and then up to 5. Okay, so from 0 to 4, and then I plus plus. And then we will check if the average for the current entry is greater than the average we find for the maximum index, then we will update the maximum index. Then the maximum index will just equal to I. So that will be your third task. And then you will just print the result. So to print the result, you can just tell the user whichever student, right? So give its name. So we know this person got the highest average of, and then we can also print out what's their average, and then give the index where does it locate, and then we finish there. Any questions here?
W- in the second line, what do we send say max is equal to after if average is greater than average max? Max is equal to what?
Okay, so this is saying if our current entry is of the average is greater than the average we have stored that contain the maximum value, like for the index, for the maximum index. So this is what we store the position for the maximum average. So if your current entry is greater, then we need to update our maximum index. So you will update your maximum index to the current one if your current entry is larger. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see the code here. Okay, so here we initialize the name, right? That's just how we set up the array. So we have the name stored in the name array. We set up the scores table to store their exam grade. And we also declare an average array to store each student's average of the 3 exams, right? So the first tag, we will read in all the exam scores one by one. And then we will calculate the average for each student. So that will be, we will go through it column by column. So the outer will be column. And then since we calculate the average, we will just go through the average array to find who got the maximum average. And then we will print the result. So there's 3 array tasks, where first 2, since we want to access the data in the school array, which is a 2D array, we have nested for loop. For the third array task, you just want to go through the average array to find the maximum value. That's a 1D array, so you'll just have a single for loop. Now to run it. Right, so it will ask you enter the for on exam 1 for Alex. So let's say Alex get 80. And then it will ask you the exam 1 score for Freddie. So let's say you have 20, and then 30, 40, or 90. And then for exam 2, for Alex, we have 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. And then once we go through all the exam 2, now we look at the exam 3. So I have 70, 80, 50, and 60, and 70. So we'll run it. Then it will give us Max got the highest average of 80. Right, so Max have an average of 80, which is the highest. Any questions here? Okay, so the code is here. Good. Okay, then we will move on. Okay. Okay, so array can also be used as input for the give me a second, there's some typo. I thought I already fixed it. I think it didn't. It didn't say properly. Okay. So an array can be used as input data for a function, right? So we know how to write a function. So so before, right, we have the input as like a variable. You can have any kind of variable. Now you can not only pass in the variable, you can also pass in array. Right, so you can also have array as your function input. Now to do it, you need to know how do we call a function with array as an argument, like as an input? And when we write the function, how do we have array as a parameter? Right, so to call a function, so to use it, you simply just give the array name. Right, so you will just give the array name as the input. And for the array, we normally have the box here, the bracket here for the for the capacity, if you have 1D array, or for the 2D array, you have 2 brackets for the row count and then the column count. But for the if you want to call a function with an array as the argument, you just supply the array name without the size. Okay, and now to set up the array as a parameter, right? Which when you trying to write a function that involved array as your input, so to set it up, you will set out the parameter, the array parameter, as how you declare the array, which you will have the data type, the array name, and then the box. Now the only difference is for the 1D array, you will leave the capacity blank, which in the box here, you don't give any number, but you still need to have the bracket there, but you just leave it empty. Now, if you have a 2D array, you will leave the row count empty, but for the column count, you need to give the size. Okay, so let's look at an example. So let's say I have an integer data of size 5. And then you want to find the maximum value of this array. So you want to print out the maximum value of this array. So to pass in the array, so to call the function, we just need to supply the array name. So we will just have data. Right, since you have the name data. Now I haven't finished here. Now to write the function, the title line is the same template or the same format as how we do function before. So we will start with the return type. So if you want to print out the maximum value of an array, then you will expect to return an integer since we have an integer array here. Right, so we will expect to return an integer, so we will start with the integer type, followed by the function name. So we have this function called max. And in the parameter, we need to set up an array. So we have an array parameter. We are passing an array. So this array is an integer type. So you have int, and then followed by however we want to set up an array. Now it doesn't need to have the same name, right? So you can name it wherever you want, but just make sure it's an array. So you have this box here. Now, one thing we need to be aware is we initialize the array, so we know what's the size of the array. But C++ doesn't know. So when you pass in this array to your function, this function doesn't know what's the size of it. So to help C++ write the program or to do its job, right? Since for the array, we need to know the size, so we know how much value to or how to go through or how many variable to go through in this array. So to help the C++, we will just provide the size of the array. So for the 1D array, we will also need to provide, besides the array, right? Whenever we provide an array, we will give a actual parameter to specify the size. So if we want to find the maximum value of this data array, we also need to give the size of data, which is 5. So to write the function, right, to set our parameter, our first parameter is an array. So we have int a with the box, means it's an array. And then the second parameter, it will be specify the size, which is the capacity. And then you will write your block of code like how you did before. Right, so to find the maximum, right, you will start, so you will, let's say you initialize the first entry as the maximum value, and then you will compare with your array or the entries in your array. So you will start with the index I to be 0. Now we need to check everything in your array, and you know that your array have a size capacity. So you need to check from I equal to 0 till I less than the capacity, and then I plus plus. So you know if your AI, your current entry is greater than the answer, which means you find a better answer, then you will update it. But then you will just go through the whole whole array, and then you will return the answer. So this will does the job. Any questions here? I see people asking, why didn't you put parameter after I plus plus? Oh yeah, there should be a parenthesis after I plus plus. Are we good here? Okay. So a few things we need to be aware is whenever we set up array parameter, set up actual parameter for the capacity if it's 1D array. And if we have 2D array, then that means you need to have actual 2 parameter, one for the row, right? One for the row count and then one for the column count. And I see people say array are always called by reference. Yes. So whenever you pass in an array to a function, if you make any changes to the array in your function, your change will be permanent. So the array, it's always be treated by call by reference. And you don't need to put the n% in front of the array, because it's always be treated by reference. And actually, if you put n% in front of it, you will get a compiler error. Your program won't run. Okay, since the array is a reference parameter. Okay. Now let's see what if we have 2D array. So let's say I have another data called data 2 of size 2 by 3. And then we have it of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you have a 2 by 3 data. So your data look like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you want to come up with a max function 2, where it will take in the 2D array. Now for the 2D array, we need to also supply the row count and then the column count. So we need to have actual parameter for the size. So we have 2 rows and 3 columns. And let's see how do we do it. Well, so we know for the max2 function, we still return an integer, right? And our first parameter is an array, integer array. And then the second parameter, it will be the row count or the size of row. And the third parameter will be for the column count. So this is how we will set up the, for the 2D array, right? We know we're supposed to have the 2 boxes, right? One for the row count and one for the column count. Now, if you remember about here, for the 2D array, we will leave the row count empty and we need to supply the column count. So if you look at here, for our array here, our column count is 3, right? We have 3 columns. So you will need to put a 3 here. So you will leave the row count empty, but you need to provide the column count. Because if you don't provide the column count, again, your program won't compile. You need to give a column count. So the C++ know is a 2D array. Okay, and I see people ask, okay, and that's a very common question. It's like if we already supply the column count, why do we need the actual parameter for column as well? The reason is for this, you need to have the column count. So C++ recognize your array here is a 2D array. But that's all C++ realize. So C++ still don't have access to the size of your array. So when you write your code, if you need the access to like how many row or how many column do you have for your 2D array, it doesn't know. You does not have access to this 3 here. So you need to manually pass in the size. Okay. Okay, I see people say the number we put here. Okay, I will say yes, because even if you don't put 3, just put any number here, your program won't run. But you should supply with the column count, because if you put any other number, it wouldn't make sense. But when you run the program, it doesn't really matter. But you should put here as you should put the column counting. But if you don't supply the column count, your program won't run. Okay, so even when you supply, you still need to have the extra parameter, right? So that's what's important here. Okay, and then the rest for the block of the code, you will do the same thing, right? So we will initialize the answer, the maximum value as the first entry. So we have A00, and then you will compare with all the entries. So you will set up the nested for loop. And since you are comparing with all the entries, it doesn't matter you start with the row or you start with the column. But we will start with the row here. So R will go from 0 to the row count, which we manually pass in. So we have access to it. And the same thing for the column. So for C, it's less than the columns. And again, if we don't give the extra parameter of the column, we won't have access to the size. Or you can see it here. There's no like okay, and then we will check if the current entry is greater than our answer, then we will update our answer to the current entry. And then we will return the answer. Okay, I see people say the first loop will always be for the column. What do you mean for the column? Our first loop is row here. The outer loop is row, and then we have inner row to be the column. Now, if you want to figure out which row, do you want to start with the row as the outer loop, or do you want to start the column as the outer loop? It depends on the question. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. For this question, it doesn't matter, because what's important is you comparing your answer with all the entry, right? So you compare each number. So it doesn't matter you go by row, or you do column by column. So if you want to have the column as the outer loop and then the row as the inner loop, that will does the same job. Right? If you want to flip this for loop, it works the same. If you look at our first example, when we calculate their average, if you want to calculate the average for each student, then you are forced to have your outer loop to be column, since you need to do it column by column. But because you are adding the score for each column, compute the average, and then you move on to the next column. Right, so the second task here, to compute the average, you are forced to do column by column. So your outer loop are forced to be column. Where the first task, to read in the score, it doesn't matter you do the row first or the column first. So if you want to read it row by row, which we did in our code here, that's fine. If you want to read it column by column, that's also fine. Then the order in which we ask the question here will be different. So instead of asking enter the score on exam 1 for Alex, exam 1 for Freddie, exam 1 for Jack, if you do it column by column, then it will ask you enter the score on exam 1 for Alex, enter the score on exam 2 for Alex, enter the score on exam 3 for Alex. And once you asked all the 3 exam score for Alex, then you will move on. What's the exam 1 score for Freddie? What's the exam 2 score for Freddie? What's the exam 3 score for Freddie? And then you move on to Jack, to Kylie, to Max. So it depends on the question, and you will determine which one you want to use. Okay, so we will end the class here. And next class, we will do more example with function involving the array.
Have a good weekend.
Okay, have a good weekend. And your next exam will be the Tuesday right before the Thanksgiving.
Professor, how many questions